Have you ever received a phone call that changed your life? I have. Back in May, I received a phone call from my dad, and it started out like most conversations that we would have. We talked about the weather. He asked about the grandchildren. But he said something during that conversation that I'll never forget. He asked me to have a seat. He said he wanted to talk to me about something important. I did. See, earlier that afternoon, he had been diagnosed with an inoperable form of throat cancer. Our world was just turned upside down. I mean, we had been through cancer with our son Michael, but nothing could have prepared me to have one of my parents call me and tell me that they had cancer as well. We laughed together that day. We cried together. We prayed together. And over the next several weeks, he began to have chemotherapy treatments. We talked on the phone several times a day. And one day I got the phone call that he was in an ambulance on his way to the hospital. My brother was behind him. He said that Dad had had a seizure and that he wasn't sure if he'd make it through the day. I got in a car and I drove all the way to California. It was the only thing that I knew to do, and by the time that I got there, Dad was in very serious condition. He was in ICU. His blood pressure was 50/30. His heart rate was 255. Basically, the way they explained it to me is his heart was just shaking inside of his chest. A nurse pulled us out of the room and talked to us, and she said that we might want to consider taking Dad home to spend the rest of his days in the presence of his family and in a place that he was comfortable. I didn't want to accept it. I went back in the room and I held Dad's hand and I looked in his eyes and I said, "Are you ready to quit?" He shook his head no. He was just a frail shell of a man. But I looked at him and I prayed with him and I said, "You know, Dad, if you're still willing to fight, I'm still willing to pray." And I told him that I was going to pray that God perform an enormous miracle in his life. And he grabbed my hand and he motioned for me to move closer to him. You see, Dad's voice was so soft that we would have to put our ear to his mouth to hear him speak. And he said these words. He said, "I don't need a big miracle. I don't need an enormous miracle. I just need a little miracle every day." And we began to pray. And we began to believe in prayer together. And God was giving him a small miracle every day. After 2 weeks, they allowed him to go home. In the comfort of his own home, he began to get better. His recovery began to speed up. I came back home to Texas. And a month later, I received another phone call. It was the phone call that I'd been waiting for all summer. He had had another MRI, and this time he says, "I've got great news." He said, "Between God and medicine," he said, "I've been completely healed of the tumor that was wrapped around the carotid artery in my throat." He was literally choking to death when they started his chemotherapy treatments. But God had healed him. Thank you, Lord. Thank you.